you know the drill. Time yourselves, have a timer, also have a timer, take POIs, cast POIs. It's important for engagement. And with that said, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open today's debate. Here.
Brilliant. Okay. Okay. Thank you everyone for waiting, and I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's quickly talk about who is most likely to engage performatively, then secondly talk about what kind of messages those people are most likely to push, then finally talk about why that is bad in terms of what we need social movements for and who they are made for. Okay, good. Let's start with who we think is most likely to engage in a performative way. I boiled it down to 3 groups. One of them is famous people like Taylor Swift, as per the info slides. The second one is companies. And thirdly is like private people. Okay, famous people and companies, I think, broadly have the same incentives when they engage with a movement in a performative way, meaning they know that this is something that is, like maybe it is to a certain extent trendy at the moment. Maybe it is something that is getting a lot of media attention. And they know by jumping onto the bandwagon, you get your money out of it, sometimes even like a level of political capital. You get revenue out of that, you get a level of status of that. And you get to frame yourself as an ally for a currently disadvantaged group, meaning that you get to frame yourself as a good person or virtuous company. Now, note that you can even still have good intention and still be engaging with a social movement in a performative way by the virtue of you not being directly affected, or by the virtue of you, for example, not properly engaging what goals this movement has. The third group of people, who I think might be the broadest group of people in this debate, are people who are not as affected. Like, for example, they are part of a certain disadvantaged group, but they still hold lots of other factors that make them relatively advantaged. Like, for example, I am a woman, but I'm also white and relatively wealthy, meaning that I am far more privileged than someone who does not have my skin color or my socioeconomic status. Those people usually jump onto those movements in terms of trendiness and in terms of social capital and in terms of wanting to feel as if you are a good person. Now, what then does this mean that you are most likely to push for, and what kind of messages are you most likely to put forward? I think if you're after it for money or social capital, your goal is to get as many people on board with you as possible, not in the sense of wanting people to participate in the social movement, but wanting to buy into the idea that what you're pushing for is a good thing and a virtuous thing. Now, then what does that look like? That means that you need to find a message when pushing for the social movement, when, like putting out messages in favor of the social movement that are not too radical and that appeal to like the most common denominator that groups have. This means that it can't be something super inflammatory. This means it has to be something rather palatable that a broad range of people can agree with. Because if Taylor Swift went out there and said, like we should, I don't know, disown all landlords or something, that would probably not go over well, because that is something that most people consider very inflammatory and rather radical, and people are not big fans of systematic change. I'll take you in a bit. Okay, now, another factor that we need to consider when talking about those groups, note that the people who engage performatively are usually quite advantaged groups of people. I already told you when I talked about celebrities, when I talked about relatively privileged private people, and when I talked about company. So know that those groups have a systematic advantage when it comes to influencing public discourse, meaning at the point where they decide to engage with the social movement and engage with its messages, it is very likely that they're going to dominate the public discourse and the public perception of what this movement wants and what its priorities are. Now, why at this point it becomes incredibly bad if they push for rather like super bland things like, like, I don't know, let's be nicer to the gays instead of talking about, instead of talking about broad systematic change. Why is that the case? Because what do we actually need social movements for? Lots of social issues are systematic issues. You can't fix some things with smaller policies. For example, streetlights do make cities better and safer for women, but you cannot kill the patriarchy with single policies. At the point where you fixate on like smaller single issue things or on like broader palatable policies, you often fail to address the root causes of systematic inequalities and about systematic issues that those groups face, because those are often deeply entrenched beliefs, sometimes even internalized by the group that is affected. They need a massive amount of political capital to fix, which the group often doesn't have, and circles around a plethora of issues. So you cannot solve systematic issues with quick fixes. Why then are social issues or social movements also very important? Because they are required as a safe space. I know we toss around the word of safe space very often, so I want to make that sound not too liberal. Okay, so what is a safe space the way we understand it? It is a group where I can be sure that either people share my lived experience and will not question it, or even if they do not share it, people will be willing to listen to that experience and entertain the idea that this might be reality, even if it doesn't apply to them. Like, for example, when I talk to men and debating about the way I get sexually harassed on a daily basis, they do not experience that themselves, but I am in a space where they are willing to engage with the possibility that this is something that is my lived reality. Those spaces are incredibly important because you receive active support through listening and just the chance of getting to be vulnerable, which you do not get to be in the outside world. But also in some areas by, like receiving funds, receiving help from people, also being active in the social movements, and just getting to be there and feel like you do not have to protect yourself constantly. Before I go on, I will take CEO.
Yeah, you explain yourself that celebrities only take low-risk, moderate positions. The comparative is not that they're going to take radical positions. It is never in their interests. What then is the harm of just saying, like, you shouldn't be homophobic?
Okay, we're getting into that. Okay, so I think at the point where people like that lead the movement and have more social capital, you have people who are less informed and less affected, calling for less useful things and more likely to flake out, meaning that it would be better if they did not engage with the social movement at all, because while it would then maybe have less impact, it would at least center the voices that are most effective, and the policies that are going to be pushed forth by those movements, or the things that those movements are being called for, are at least the ones that serve the community best. It dilutes the original values and messages. If you want to be performative, you want to appeal as many people, you need to be palatable. But as I explained, most social issues require radical change. I think the counterfactual, if those people do not call for that, you at least still center the people who are most affected, meaning at the very least, you get even if you get less political change done, you at least retain those safe spaces that people need and that social movements can bring them uniquely. Whereas if you dilute the original messages, you decenter the people who are in most need of the social movement period and are most affected by it disappearing. At the point where we center performative people, we center people who are not affected, while crowding out people with less social capital. Meaning that we have someone who is performative now dominating the conversation, where I, as a person, do not get to participate in the social movement anymore. Meaning that we might have social movement who are like somewhat more effective, but calling for less useful things that are less, like beneficial for the people most affected by those social issues. Proud.
Great. I think that speaker very much had a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to a leader of opposition to open their side in today's debate. Here.
Is everyone, wait, let me grab my phone. All right, perfect. Is everyone ready? I will be taking POIs in the chat. 3, 2, 1. If there's one main thing in common, it's that OO and OG both want positive change in the world, and they both want, let's say, radical change. The difference is how we approach such. I think I want to note two things at the top of the case. I think firstly is noting the comparative among OG. I think much of what OG talks about isn't necessarily like offensive towards their case, or at least like things that are going to bring them the win. Note firstly on the rebuttal, I think the main thing we got out of OG was this idea that people who are performative are essentially dominating the movement. I want to respond to this in two key ways. I think firstly, there's just a general acknowledgement among people who are within the performative movement that they are in this place of privilege, that they want to have a level of understanding. This tangibly looks like when they're doing their performative action or performative engagement, reposting, places from excerpts, reposting sources, reposting other areas. So rather than the framing that we got from OG, this is somehow a domination of the conversation, I would instead say it is an expansion of the conversation that is brought upon by people understanding that they are in a place of privilege, and through the good intentions that OG is talking about, thus then actively trying not to dominate the conversation and instead incentivizing other people to do so. I think secondly, on this idea of actively sharing safe spaces that we got on the offensive side here, I think if we're talking about, sharing a safe space and creating sunny side voters, I think the comparative is incredibly important. That in order to get engaged in political action, you need some sort of lever in order to create that change. I think there are very few people in this world who are born thinking that property should be abolished. But if they then have a timeline where they first learn about the injustices within capital, and then secondly learn about these other areas, and sure have performative action, that is going to means by which OO is willing to stand on as to how we get the actions that OG wants to talk about themselves. With that being said, I'm going to get onto my case. We have two main positive points here. Firstly, how this is able to actually create tangible change, and secondly, diving into the celebrity aspect. I think firstly, on the top of case, we would agree pretty much with OG in this aspect of who the stakeholders are within this debate. Additionally, expanding on the framing, we think this debate is about doing more harm than good. And I want to note the very little amount of harm that was brought upon by OG, that most of it just tended to be contextualization. We would finally like to add on understanding the audience that many of the people who they're talking about who are engaging with this performative engagement tend to be young people. We believe this for two reasons. We think firstly, like celebrities just generally have an audience of young people. And secondly, when you're talking about performative engagement, it tends to be people who have never been involved in politics or likely can't even vote to begin with. And as a result, we believe that's where you get the comparative, where this is pretty much the only, not only feasible, but practical way they are able to create any change. We think the margins then are creating engagement through this performative engagement. So starting on the first piece of positive matter here on how this creates tangible change at an individual level. I think firstly, we would say there's a tangible benefit to allyship at an individual level. I think establishing extra context here that social movements tend to be about people, whether it be through Black Lives Matter, or whether it be through the gay movement, or whether it be through like the LGBTQ movement. And I want to firstly note at the top of this that we are all experiencing how performative engagement was able to help shift the overturn window. When, for example, you see like a gay pride flag, sure, there are some people, I'm just anticipating, who might experience backlash. For a majority of people, they have grown up seeing these performative things, and as a result, the overturn window has shifted to where they acknowledge at their base, oh, absolutely, gay marriage should be legal. Oh, absolutely, people should have rights. When this is something that previously was debated 20 years ago, I think a big part of this was like the natural culture and performative engagement of starting at a young age and getting these ideas at a young age. We think the link is that when you're creating tangible benefit to allyship, when you see people who you idolize welcome you, you are able to feel more welcome. We believe this is in two layers. Firstly is on the performers themselves, kind of at a celebrity level. But then secondly, those who represent / share the movement. We think from a peer-to-peer level, especially if we're talking about something like the gay movement or like the LGBTQ movement, when you see a friend reposting it about something, you feel more welcome that you are able to talk to them and able to bring up these issues, essentially creating some form of safe space in this, whatever liberal term that OG was talking about. We think secondly on how this creates tangible change, it creates more buy-in within the movement at a macro scale. And we're going to engage in the two different actors that OG talked about. Firstly, on the businesses, we think even if there is a superficial benefit, this is able to impact people through starting at an individual level and then going to a micro level. We think for the most part, businesses, right, do nothing and don't benefit anything. But I think at the point where OG per se does like, an LGBTQ movement and donates $200,000 because they want performative engagement, we think then that is the buy-in that we want to be able to create. But before I continue, I'll take a point from closing government.
What happens when people develop a shallow understanding of a social issue and then people who are suffering internalize this as a commodification of the suffering that they have faced?
Yeah, so we think the link there then is that they have to make it work within their case as to how somehow having a shallow understanding is going to immediately result in people for some reason having the resentment or having their backlash. We anticipate this case, and I'll get into this later in my case. The impact of the buy-in we're talking about is businesses being much friendlier towards the cause and donating to the cause. We think the comparative is much better than businesses being very indifferent because at all times they have a profit incentive to not engage with this politics. We think secondly towards politicians, if politicians have this perception that there are a bunch of young people who sure are performatively engaged with, let's say, LGBTQ rights, they're more likely to have it be something that they either don't want to engage with or support because they want voters. And we think tangibly this allows the buy-in that we're talking about. We think finally this gets more people involved within the movement. And this is going to be something that kind of internally addresses what CG was talking about. We think that by engaging in the superficial level, it serves as a platform for more engagement, with the mechanism being the constant exposure that essentially brings you to the bottom line. So sure, at first you may learn something shallow, and sure, maybe even it does cause some backlash that people think it is cheesy, but we think later in your life, you are then able to get a better understanding in the same way that like in middle school, you initially learn about racism, and then in college, you learn about like advanced racism, you learn about systemic cause, and you learn about a much deeper form of it. We think that in order to get to that second step, you have to at some extent internalize the first step within itself. We think then shifting the overturn window is important. Finally, getting into our main second point on diving into celebrity change, We think the culture of celebrity politics is good for a few reasons. We think, one, it leads to donators and performances at the rallies. This looks like Lady Gaga saying, all of her fans, I'm going to support the LGBTQ movement. Sure, it was performative, but it was some form of action, and all of those fans see it as the base level. We think, secondly, it creates more accountability for celebrities. How? By creating a metric for change and exposing hypocrisy. An example would be if a celebrity talks about feminism, but then sings a sexist song, the people who are opposing this now have a general metric by which they can create a clear framework for cultural change within the audience. Why does this matter? On two reasons. Firstly, the alternative, as pointed out in the POI, is inaction and silence. And secondly, it influences the audience at a young age and allows for the voter buy-in that I was talking about. Finally, how do we believe this is not going to create the backlash that is talked about? We think at the point where there are good intentions, you cannot buy off the government case that somehow everyone is going to feel disgusted by this performative engagement. And rather that the analysis we provide serves as a good mechanism as to how this creates more engagement, especially at the youngest level. For all those reasons, urge a strong vote. Thank you.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
You're unmuted.
Thank you. Great. 1 second. I need this. Okay. No. Whatever. Okay. Panel, the timeline of when you engage performatively with social movement is really crucial here, i.e., because the people that only engage with it performatively aren't the ones who rely on the social change for a better life, but do it for political and economical brownie points for themselves, it means that they don't do it at a time when it's hugely controversial and they are at risk for social and political backlash. And secondly, don't do it at a time when people don't yet know about it. That means the impacts of awareness, increased visibility, and acceptance are unlikely to accrue at the stage when they are likely to perform with this, to engage with this performatively, right? It means that the shift of the Overton window that OO talks about has to come before they engage with the performatively, and they only engage with it performatively because the Overton window has already shifted, right? That means our case of it crowding out effective and authentic voices that did and would lead to more effective change does happen, because basically interest and relevance for these topics exists symmetrically. It is the condition for performative engagement. That means the comparative isn't the of Overton window shifting, but it already haven't shifted before. Once I am interested and once I already consider relevant, that is when the comparative comes in. And the comparative is then, do I have easy access to authentic, effective voices and relevant material? Or do I have to first dig through a bunch of trash, which is distracting and likely to prevent my engaging in a good way ever? It is things like, oh, I kind of care about Black issues, so I Google Black Panther. Or what do I do if I want to advance the Black cause? And on Gov, instead of radical protest group Black Panther and my engagement with that, I find Wakanda and the fight against Thanos, right? Or in education, when my kid is told, oh, task, make a presentation about someone who did a lot for women's causes. On opposition, he will do the presentation about how Taylor Swift had songs about her boyfriends. On government, it's about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and case about the sexes. That means that on either side of the house, there are individuals that exist that have the need to do something. The comparative then is that same need going to be satisfied by either posting a Black square on Insta or sharing a Taylor Swift song? Or is it joining your local suffragette or Black Justice chapter and protest in front of a political office? So the harm that is created at the point where it is normalized to satisfy your need for engagement on government with tangible, effective engagement and on op with performative engagement. That means even if the comparative, as CO tries to POI in, is that Taylor Swift says nothing about feminism, that is still less harmful than her engaging performatively. Lastly, the loss of a say-so within the social movements that Mira has already mentioned. On government, the people within these social movements are the ones most affected. They are the ones that are most involved. They're the ones that set the agenda and understand their own issues and have an audience that listens to them. Because again, the shift of the Overton window and the acceptance of this issue is the precondition for you to engage performatively. That means on either side, there is an audience for this. The question is, who then does this audience listen to? Is it Taylor Swift? Or is it a feminist politician, a feminist activist, somebody like who gets asked about feminist issues in media? Is it your local chapter, or is it Taylor Swift or some other fake celebrity? On the OO point of, people will actively try not to dominate the conversation, because that's what we're basically saying. At the point where you engage performatively, then performative engagement is incentivized for lots and lots of people to do. That is where the white feminists join, I don't know, all these things and say, oh no, actually my lived experience of getting 3% less in salary is actually the most important thing, and not, I don't know, black mortality rates when giving birth, right? That is the comparative here. And people will think that their thing is the most important thing. One, because we tend to believe ourselves more and consider ourselves the most important thing generally. Secondly, people are arrogant and just want to be the center of attention. That means at the point where you say, ah, yes, do it, be the center of attention, I will be like Taylor Swift. You like the performative being literally means you want the recognition and praise for this. The performative element, performing, is necessity for you to feel like really important. Secondly, on the idea, oh, this will feel people more welcome. First, on a peer-to-peer level, people see their friends reposting pro-LGBT things and feeling seen. That is not necessarily the same. It's not going to affect me that much. It also straight people showing up in my LGBTQ things, which is annoying at best and scary at worst, because I can't be sure they understand how urgently I need them not to out me, because they think, oh, it's all fun and games, right? But it's really not, because it might actually have really negative impacts on my life. Then on the last part, if OO says, oh yes, well, we all want change, so aren't we actually in agreement? No, because what actually brings change, radical change, is often that, radical, and sometimes even violent. It requires commitment and willingness to face negative consequences like violence and jail time. The right to vote wasn't because the, sorry, dog, and yes. What actually then brings change? Radical change is often that, radical and violent. It requires commitment and willingness to face negative consequences like violence and jail time. The right to vote for women wasn't acquired by, ooh, let's, I don't know, write an article in the Post and wear a ribbon or anything. No, it was literally bombing buildings and shit. Anti-apartment, social justice movement in the US, women's suffrage, performative engagement. You don't get those people, or people who fuck up as soon as it comes to that. Before I continue, CO.
Yeah, can you explain why violent radicalism is a good thing? It seems maybe bad.
Sure, it seems maybe bad. At the point where there is people who feel that disenfranchised, and their political system doesn't allow for them to get to a point where, or to get the social change that they need through non-violent means. Like, for example, women had no democratic recourse to ask for the right to vote. Like, you can't vote in favor of the right to vote if you can't vote. It's things like this where we say, okay, probably without the performative engagement means you do not get these people, or the people who you do still get will fuck off as soon as it comes to the more radical part. It is necessary that the performative engagement doesn't take precedent. And at the point where the people pushing performative engagement are the ones with the largest platform to perform on, and that is often celebrities, that is often people who just have the largest stage and largest audience. At that point, you get active harm, both on the safe space within those social movements, and secondly, on the actual change, the tangible change that it actually brings. For those reasons, proud to be an opening government.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to a Deputy Leader of Opposition.
I firstly want to engage with crowding out, then I want to engage with the idea of like the movement as a whole, and finally I'll engage with anything that's left over. Let's first deal with crowding out. I think government has causation and correlation backwards. I don't think that the reason necessarily that, for instance, white feminism is the front of feminism is necessarily because it's like the most like I think that the reason fundamentally it's at the front is because it's the most palatable to the general public. So I think that as a whole, what this means is that historically it's been pushed to the front because of the ground of feminism that the general public is most willing to engage with. I want to be clear here. The alternative isn't then instead you would have a black trans rights at the forefront of discourse. It's just you don't have discourse about these issues at all. Once you introduce the public towards, for instance, broad feminist ideas, it's when you actually move the entire idea forward. Let's look at this a bit more analytically. I think the first thing I want to point out is that you need to start from somewhere. I think it's important to start with the general, even more privileged group for two reasons. I think the first thing is you have to build up your support base. So if you're looking for political capital, it's often going to come from relatively more privileged, marginalized communities, and this is for a few reasons. I think the first thing is they have the time, they have the money, and they have the capital, and they have the capacity to do so. Given this, then once you start building a support base, you can build things like lobbying groups. You can push companies to do things. You have donations towards charities to support more oppressed groups who are unable to represent themselves. Given this, then all this is prerequisite on in the first place building up a large enough support base to do all of this. But I think the second reason you have to start from somewhere is that it's about general exposure. So for instance, if the general public doesn't understand much about feminism in the first place, or isn't acclimatized to the entire discourse about feminism, or is broadly uncomfortable talking about women's rights, you aren't going to be able to engage them on the most radical issues. Instead, you're just going to try to deny that they exist as a whole. I think this is really important as a prerequisite. I think the first thing is that you have to have the broad concept be accepted first. I think this is relatively intuitive. Black feminism intersectionality is only palatable if feminism as a whole is accepted. And this is just because of the reasons that OG points out. Like people don't want necessarily to engage within like the more radical groups. People would rather engage with the things that are easier to talk about. But I think the important thing is that this acts as the gateway. And the reason for this is very simple. There are always going to be people pushing for more radical ideals. And there are two reasons for this. One, there are people who are always constantly affected by this, meaning that they want to create change for themselves. But two, I think there are also just generally people who are very passionate or well-read about this who want to create change on behalf of others. Given this then, I think it's unfair to characterize opposition as exclusively a performative world. You got to understand that our world is closer to, for instance, what the black suffrage movement was like, for instance, where it worked in conjunction with MLK's movement and the Black Panthers, where more moderate and radical groups work together. You can't just isolate one and blame the harms. The only reason that radical groups can engage as a whole with the discourse is because of moderate groups. I think again there are some structural reasons for this. I think radicalism is only effective with large support. Two reasons. The first is that this is the difference between governmental organizations or the general public engaging in crackdowns versus negotiations. You only engage in negotiations if you think those negotiations are going to be popular general public, which we recognize now the first is only happens when you have, for instance, people reposting even superficially this idea of like supporting black rights or gay rights. But I think the second reason is that you actively need the body to engage with. Governments don't want to be seen as negotiating with people who commit acts of violence. That's why, for instance, the government negotiated with MLK's group and not the Black Panthers, because they need a body to engage with. The body in the status quo are the performative actors, people like celebrities, for instance, or just like leaders of these general movements, because again, they are generally palatable towards these politicians and therefore provide a face to engage with. I think the next thing I want to point out is that the reason the opposition calls opposition out for only being able to pass things, like for instance, adding more streetlights. The first thing I'll point out is that like these things are generally beneficial. Sure, maybe it doesn't completely dismantle this idea of like the norm regarding around the unsafety of women, but at the very least, it is some marginal change that you might not be achieving on top in the first place when this discourse doesn't exist. But I think the second thing to point out is it's impossible to dismantle again this whole idea of like, for instance, the harmful culture regarding women as a whole if you aren't at least superficially engaged in this idea that women are oppressed in the first place. I think this is also relatively intuitive. I think it makes it socially okay, so when, for instance, make it socially unacceptable to victim blame women, and when people are called out for victim blaming women, this is at the point when you open dialogue to more harmful norms versus the alternative of, for instance, mentors denying it, like we've seen years ago. I think at this point, then you have to credit opposition with creating any forward progress at all. I also think then it's also unfair. Then the big response that comes out of the DPM and the only real response we should receive for a case that's like relatively significant, is that you only perform when you only engage in performances when it's uncontroversial. A few things. One, it's empirically untrue. I don't think feminism as a whole is uncontroversial within the United States. Maybe in California it is, but then within the broader world, within the broader country, it isn't. But also, secondly, on the international stage, it just isn't. Like, sure, it might be culturally accepted within certain parts, within Europe, for instance, but it's not within like India. It's not within China, for instance. All of this is also being spread by celebrities, by activists, by performatism. That's exposing the general world. But I think the final thing I'll point out under this, and this is also really important, celebrities don't want to be seen as performative. Being seen as performative is something that is somewhat stigmatized, because celebrities always have an incentive to push the boundaries, to actually back up their actions. So they can't just say they like support feminism and then release a sexist song, because then people know they're performative, and this is a norm, and this is like a stigmatization against it. Given this, then this is always constant incentive to do more, not more and more extreme things, but more and more like radical things until eventually, things that are always somewhat controversial. I'll take a POI from CG if they have one.
Why does the government have to negotiate with Taylor Swift than a more peaceful academic activist in the movement? I fail to understand the mutual exclusivity, not to mention not all movements are violent. This only applies to selective movements.
So I think the issue is that they aren't going to engage with academics for a few reasons. One, the reason that governments engage with anyone at all is because there are massive perception benefits for the government. The reason like the government does anything is because they want to get reelected, for instance, at least assuming like relatively democratic countries. Given this, then engaging with academics might make academics happy, and it might even make and probably makes the world a better place, but doesn't align with the incentive of governments, which is to appeal to their voter base. The only way that you appeal to the greater voter base is by getting voter base as a whole to engage with these issues. I just think it's also just empirically untrue and incredibly unintuitive that the alternative with the government, for instance, negotiating with the general public or negotiating with large social movements, even on a superficial level, is engaging with like professors who studied years and years, who don't really talk to the public, who don't engage with the public, who don't like give press conferences, because again, there's no benefit to the government. Like, sure, maybe governments do care somewhat about like the general good, but like they're pretty shitty as a whole, and I don't really trust them. I think the final thing I want to engage with really quick is that like they say that, well, this is going to crowd out activists, people who actually care about the movement. I genuinely think that people who legitimately care about the movement are not going to be satisfied with like researching Wakanda and calling it a day. Obviously, they're going to try to go beyond, and people who don't care about the movement aren't going to do as much, and they only want to get superficially anyway. There's no margin within this. You got to understand that there's different actors. Very proud to oppose.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to go to the Gov member. Here.
Just checking. Can I be heard? Fantastic. POIs exclusively in the chat, please. I will. Oh, you're my priority, but I'm open to taking closing opposition as well. I'm not picky. It's one of my best traits. So, okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The strategy we're going to take in closing government is going to be simple. We're going to explain to you exactly why it is that the groups that we're often talking about are the worst people who can necessarily be the ones advocating for you in the first place, and actively either cause you more publicity issues that necessarily weaken the strength of your movement, or create more directive opposition to your movement, which means you don't actually get any of the change you necessarily want. Going further than opening government, challenging opening opposition. So what am I going to cover in this speech? First of all, 2 pieces of framing, then I'm going to go into the 2 arguments. 1, why is it that often celebrities or corporations are willing to do these things as active cover-ups for the bad actions that they necessarily have committed in the past? Why, when this is found out, this causes significant amounts of issue. 2, why it is that even just the existence of, say, celebrities advocating for these things in the first place often create an opposition, often create more opposition, whether that be within the movements themselves or from outside the movements. Responses to opening opposition will be integrated throughout. 2 pieces of framing then to begin with. 1, celebrities and corporations, etc., are just never going to be perfect actors. There are always going to be some problematic aspect to them in the first place, right? Why is this true with regards to celebrities? Well, first of all, they just live very public lives, which have the ability to be very stressful, right? So even if they necessarily have pure intentions, at the point where they necessarily have the ability to make some mistake, this mistake necessarily gets recorded by paparazzi who follow them around a lot in their private lives and have active incentives to spin this in narratives that necessarily get sold within the papers, right? That's why you have situations where, say, flippant example, but I think this demonstrates my point brilliantly. Years ago, when like Britney Spears was like the face of Pepsi, it was a really big controversy that she was seen drinking a Coke once, or vice versa. I can't remember exactly which way around it was, right? But those are the sorts of things they're willing to do. They're trying to undermine their personality by necessarily looking for those mistakes, right? But two, they're also under a very stressful position, which means they're likely going to do more and more extravagant, stupid things, right? The fact that they might get drunk with regards to like alcohol or drugs or power necessarily means they're likely going to cause some form of slip up, right? But also these people don't tend to be fully educated on the issues that necessarily affect people on the street, right? Which means they often can have the ability to seem as if they're removed from reality insofar as the views they necessarily have. Look at Kelly Osbourne years ago saying, of course we shouldn't deport Mexican people. Who else is going to clean the White House, right? An incredibly out of touch thing to necessarily say. She thought that she was doing well, but it was completely stupid, right? So that's why, and also corporations, at the point where they necessarily care about the bottom line and profits, they often have to do things that are necessarily going to cause damage specifically to the things that they necessarily care about, right? Look at the amount of companies who say that they care about, say, environmental causes, but then also just do things like active water pollution in order to be able to make their products, or even just saying we care about gay people without necessarily employing them or paying them what they deserve, right? So that means we don't think they can be perfect actors. Second framing then. Why there are going to be lots of people who are like adverse to this change happening in the first place? A couple of reasons for this as well. One, some people just be racist and don't believe that rights for all necessarily exist, right? We think obviously that's the worst trait. We also just think that there are some people who are just actively against what they would necessarily see as like a significantly progressive culture necessarily taking over, right? They see this as attacking certain values they necessarily represent, which is one, I think that's wrong, but two, just problematic. But two, there are also just people who might necessarily benefit from the ways operating at the moment that they already do, right? These are people who might necessarily get a significant amount of funding from right-wing structures that necessarily like certain things to be the way they necessarily are. Finally, you also just have people who are just generally fearful of change, right? Look at the amount of narratives that exist that basically try to explain things that say certain ideologies are now out there to corrupt your children, right? The media narrative rhetoric is often quite harmful. So how does this then interact with the two extensions I'm going to run? First of all, at the point where celebrities or general actors are going to necessarily make mistakes and mess up, often these things will be counter to the messages that they were. First of all, we think that in some situations, people only decide to advocate for these things and be performative if they actively have something to try and defend themselves from, right? Look at the amount of people who donate to, say, feminist causes and, like, say, women's shelters because they don't want to be Me Too, right? They see the narratives of necessarily being out there because of the way of their sexual exploits. I don't want this to happen. So when those things come out, they want to be able to say, no, I didn't engage in those negative actions. Look at the amount of positive that I've done with regards to this, right? What that does, it shuts down active discussion of harmful individuals who necessarily these movements would probably want to get rid of in the first place. And these are probably like the biggest examples of harm that can be actually perpetuated via this. But they now get a free pass because they're advocating for these things freely, right? I think that also just makes the entirety of the movement look incredibly weak because they no longer have the ability to remove this person, right? They're so dependent on this person for being able to get a lot of their media discussion in the first place that they don't have the ability to shut them out. That also just makes them look like a pathetic aspect in the first movement in the first place that isn't actually able to get any further change, right? But it also just means that, like, when your first port of call becomes those individuals, your willingness to engage with the rest of the movement becomes suspect at the point where you necessarily think that, well, is the movement just going to be more of these people who necessarily have ill intentions, right? That necessarily means you weaken the ability for people to get on board with this and advocate. Opening quickly.
Yeah, if we buy that people are going to always dig into celebrities' backgrounds, and we buy that celebrities who are very dangerous are willing to do this, wouldn't that have an internal tension that then they would be more likely to be found and held accountable of the things you're talking about?
Right. So no, because I think because the discussion specifically happens in the situation, because look, I think they'll be found out on both sides. I think significantly the difference in this situation is the response of the celebrity, right? If they are not advocating for these things and found out, they have to face up to this and have to deal with the fact that they've done wrong, right? That often just means that they're more willing to just put themselves through like the scorning that necessarily happens, right? The problem then, like I said, is if they have the ability to have some form of defense and try and deny their actions specifically, it becomes a lot harder to actually pin down on these people. But also just you split the movement even more. Some people who believe this person is in the right, some people who believe this person is in the wrong, which leads to the second impact that we talked about, opposition to the movement, right? Look, there are just going to be some people who do not like these celebrities at all, right? Not everyone is a Swiftie. Not everyone likes Beyonce. There are just people who necessarily believe that these people are overrated, right? What that basically means is when you necessarily attach them to the movement as well, they see themselves as antithetical to that movement because they're like, oh, if that's the sort of person that attracts, I'm not going to go anywhere near it because it doesn't seem to be for me. I think you probably risk a lot more people by making it on the basis of the cult of personality, whereas actually what would be better is if you had the academic experts who've already talked about, look, I think this is a significant win for CG.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the extension speaker from side closing opposition to open their side in today's debate. Here.
Hello, just checking I'm audible.
Perfectly audible.
Sick. POIs in chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Two parts to this speech. Firstly, I'll explain why these celebrities are not bad, and then I'll explain why they're good. Firstly, why are they not bad? I think we hear a series of, like, I guess quite uncharitable and I think honestly quite silly characterizations coming out from the Gov bench. I'm going to go through them one by one. The emergent characterization here will be celebrities have both the incentive and capacity to do this generally pretty well. I think at worst for side opposition, that is harmless and therefore means that affirmative can't meet their burden. All right. Firstly, their claim is, celebrities don't know very much about these social movements, and so they're going to be offensive and tone deaf. They're going to say things which, aren't necessarily true or don't reflect the deep theory of these movements. They give the example that potentially, if you're trying to talk about Black people's rights, you'll talk about Wakanda. I think there are a series of problems. I think the first and most obvious is clearly if you did that, you would just get owned. Everyone would think you were quite silly. You would get dogpiled on social media for engaging in a particular, honestly, quite a comical way. I think the reason for that is that society is broadly relatively woke these days. It's getting more woke. I think people feel quite hostile towards this kind of mega cringe, clearly performative engagement, which I think means that likely what celebrities do is they research the movement before they post. They post in relative generality. They're not super specific. Why would they be prescriptive about what people should believe about feminism? And I think crucially, it is likely that they amplify people in the movement because, of course, you don't want the movement to criticize you. If you are Taylor Swift trying to talk about feminism, is extremely embarrassing if feminists then criticize you online. So what you're likely to do is engage with feminists. You might do things like bring them on your podcast if you have one. You might do things like retweet their tweets on Twitter, which I think suggests that this is likely to be actually amplificatory rather than competing for airtime. And I would note that a lot of the characterization we get from closing government suggests that this is particularly likely because they explain that it is very costly for celebrities to be involved in scandals, that celebrities are scrutinized intensely. If that is true, that bears out our analysis about how celebrities are likely to go about doing this. The second claim we get from opening government is that white feminists hijack this discourse. They make it all about themselves. I think the clear problem with this analysis is it is symmetrical, and it is in fact worse if they do that within, I guess, more activist parts of the movement. Who cares if they're clogging the airwaves a bit? It is far better than if they hijack actual groups that are doing things. If they make fundraising worse, things like that. I don't think they're comparative here. What we hear then from closing government is that they will cynically, evil men will cynically use feminist activism to cover up their Me Too crimes. I think this is quite absurd because their characterization here is that they would get away with it. But I think most people have quite a innate dislike of hypocrisy. And I think it is actually far more likely that people want to do things like call them out or expose bad behavior if it is clearly discordant with their stated public positions. It actually becomes, I think, more lucrative for the media to cover these things because it is so jarring and I think it looks quite controversial. I do not think people just buy the argument that, I donated to some charities, so I'm fine. I think that that is something that actually makes people more likely to respond, not less. But even if it is true that these celebrities sometimes do things which are controversial or which look bad, I think that is often good. People understand that celebrities are imperfect, so this often becomes an opportunity for discourse to explain why their position is wrong and how they can do better. I don't think that government does really any good work to explain why it's bad if people sometimes say things which are silly and wrong. I'll take a point before I move on to why this is good.
Yeah, so the problem is when they're necessarily seen as hypocritical is that people already looking to devalue that movement in the first place now just say that the entirety of the movement or the significant amount of the movement are also hypocritical and also have these stances. That makes it harder to enact change.
like literally who does that persuade? Like if you're a young girl getting into feminism and you've got lots of feminist role models and there's one drunk celebrity who says a stupid thing, I just am uncompelled that that would be something that deters you from feminism. And your characterization is that people understand celebrities to be frequently unserious people. So I do not think it is true that this meaningfully deters people. I think the effect of that discourse is likely good on net, likely educational on net. We have lots of other people to look to who are less problematic. All right, let's then talk about why it is likely that this is actively good. And the first thing I want to do is a full-throated defense of moderation, because the rest of this debate bizarrely assumes that it is bad to be moderate, even though they concede that everyone seems to like moderateness. So I'm going to explain that it is probably good, even if opening government is right that these guys are cowardly and moderate, that is a good thing. A couple of things to say here. The first thing I want to note is I think there are a series of immediate benefits that you can get if you are moderate. Those are things like acceptance and representation, which do not require you to push boundaries, but do make people feel particularly validated. And I think that is good because it is an immediate improvement to people's quality of life, rather than a speculative gamble that blowing up pipelines will go well, rather than get you arrested. But I think it also just looks like low-hanging fruits that are currently competing for attention, and celebrities can draw attention to them in a way which galvanizes change, because like there's lots of social movements. They're often extremely diffuse. It's often hard to make change because they're all competing against each other. But when, for instance, Taylor Swift is like, well, AI revenge porn is incredibly bad, that is something that very immediately galvanizes support around that specific thing, which allows you to get change, which, yeah, sure, it's something which most people agree on, something which is popular, but that is precisely why it's good to galvanize support around getting that change. So why is moderation broadly good? I think that they literally admit that it is something which is quite popular, and I think that is generally a good thing for the reason that it creates a perception that these movements are far more reasonable. I think that is particularly important in contexts where these movements are otherwise relatively repressed, where people see them as extremist. Having a moderate face is something which makes people in these movements actively safer. It means that these movements are far more likely to be persuasive to people who are hostile towards extremism, towards radicalism, to people who, for instance, remember radicals in their country doing terrible things. It's probably good if you have a more moderate face of that movement. But the other thing I want to note is I think you get far less gatekeeping on our side. Most of this debate is about celebs so far, but this debate is also just about ordinary people who are posting things on their Instagram story. And I think the impact here is massive because there's just a huge amount of people doing those things. And I want to note that this means like the popularization of this kind of engagement means that those people have a far lower barrier to entry to activism. They, do not have to put a huge amount of resources or time or risk into doing things like blowing up pipelines. And that is incredibly good because it gives them a way to funnel that frustration and express their political beliefs that is far more constructive and socially appealing than things which, by opening government's own admission, are violent. I do not think they do sufficient work to explain why that would be a good thing. I think it is probably good if people express their views in more constructive ways. Finally, I just want to talk why this is kind of a good business decision. They claim that businesses and celebrities are responding to essentially market forces, that young women want celebrities to talk about womanhood, or queer people want gay events with rainbow branding. I think what this suggests is that there is a real organic desire for these things. I think it's really good when the market fulfills it. Like people get stuff that they want. They get a feeling of satisfaction. They're likely to have increased engagement and feeling of belonging in society. But also you just have economic empowerment. Like people are able to, for instance, go to queer events or buy into, female empowerment products. I think this is broadly a great opportunity for people to engage in. I think they do almost no work to explain why that kind of thing would not be good, given so many people want it and are actually quite desperate to engage with it. The weighing here is that achievable, small, shallow changes happen. They mean a lot to people in the short run. They make people's lives immediately better. You should not gamble that away for a speculative, radical risk.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to give the floor to the government whip. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, beginning my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Also POIs in the chat. Craig's extension wasn't that all celebrities are evil individuals, but rather they're imperfect like us. But their imperfection often costs the movement significantly simply by association. First of all, on opening opposition's argument on how it shifts the Overton window discussion and gets you more political capital. I just want to note here is that my POI was simply that this will fracture the movement because some people are going to internalize that you're monetizing on their suffering. And I just want to flag that even if performative activists don't crowd out the movement in opening government's world or in closing opposition's world, they are simply like the most noble actors to begin with because they've conducted research. You will still internalize the message or them performing in a negative manner as well. There are two reasons for this. But the first one is these accusations will simply exist within the media because this can be used as a propaganda policy or tool, maybe by Fox News or actors that are like opposed to that movement to begin with. Or certain critics might genuinely believe that this is the case for ideological reasons as well, and the fact that you simply shouldn't exploit victims because it has happened in the past as well. Why will this then be internalized in this manner? The first one is that people are suffering and grieving, and more than charity and donations, they want justice and meaningful action on the ground as well. People have a negativity bias, and therefore they're much more susceptible to this narrative as well. But secondly, their negative emotions often compound due to their survival mechanisms as well. This is where the crab analogy comes in. If I go to the beach once and a crab bites me, and there's like a 99% chance that when I go to the beach next time, the crab won't bite me, I would be so scared of going to the beach or simply going to the water just because the crab has bitten me before as well. Humans are risk aversive, and even if the chances of like losses or like bad memories is like low, this is something that constantly stays within the human mind just so that we can cope with that as well. Therefore, even if these celebrities aren't like threatening and platforming themselves in comparison to your own self, the way that you rationalize this sense of danger is that this leads to like friction within the movement and not just alienation that happens in opening government. Because the extent of opening government's rebuttal was that people might feel alienated when their safe spaces might get hijacked by some other individuals, whereas closing government's response circumvents opening opposition's critique to opening government, that even if performance expand the conversation rather than dominate the conversation, that will still be internalized in a bad manner. Why is that then specifically bad? First of all, politicians can attack the movement by saying this isn't unified. Look, there's like one camp that is saying A, then there's another camp that's saying B. Which camp do we believe? But secondly, when people feel that the movement is having an argumentation themselves, and most people don't like to argue because like it brings like memories of pain for them, then it essentially means that people often lose interest and want to just like disassociate themselves if like something is becoming too contentious within a movement to begin with as well. But lastly, the messaging to the followers gets compromised as well. Like which leader do you listen to? The one that says that we should platform these activists, or the one that says that these activists are monetizing on our suffering? Secondly, they talked about the fact that the governments can negotiate with certain performers, so this is a good substitute. Again, based on my POI, they never showed mutual exclusivity there. But I would also like to note, and respectfully to all the Taylor Swift fans, is that performative activists are a bit of a joke in reality. Like Craig gave you many mechanisms why these public figures are likely to make mistakes, and these mistakes are likely to be sensationalized within the media simply because they have a following to begin with as well, and why by association the movement is going to suffer. Craig gave you many many illustrations of how celebrities have said stuff even though support a movement, even if they didn't mean that in a derogatory manner. That was simply how it was spun within the media, because these people often have that publicity capital to begin with as well. But secondly, people in general, like especially outside the USA, are more likely to trust an academic because their parents have constantly told them, you want to do something good in life, become a teacher, become a doctor, become a scientist. So these are the people that people often hold in high esteem. Yes, I love to watch Taylor Swift, like maybe momentarily in some performance, but I wouldn't want Taylor Swift to represent me in a law of court. Just like that, I wouldn't want Taylor Swift to represent me in front of a government when Taylor Swift does not have the education necessary to do so as well. But lastly, they say that performative activists can act as a stepping stone as well. But this doesn't respond to Craig's analysis that often this leads to a shallow understanding of the issue by these performers to begin with. And even if they like have a widespread awareness, why that is simply a trade-off that isn't worth it. The first reason is that shallow understanding occurs within the moment. It maybe lasts for like 1 month, 2 months, but the deeper understanding that you can get of the topic is something that can last much more permanent as well. But if certain attacks are developed because you have an association that is shallow, then these stereotypes can be much more permanent in nature and can have a significant longevity of impact as well. But secondly, you give ammunitions to the enemy, like the state or whichever person that you're campaigning against, who often has disproportionate power over you as well. This means that this compound the harm that these people can inflict upon you. Before I move on, CO.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So the backlash that you're talking about is incredibly symmetric and at best very marginal. Conservatives will always be trying to look for a way to hate on social movements. Compare this to the action we create through public change and
Yes,
public
but
perception.
they give you so many lines of analysis why these people are often the ones that are most susceptible to this form of criticism to begin with, because oftentimes they either do this for whitewashing reasons or because they have done something in their public life which then gets projected onto that social movement, even if the social movement doesn't want that. Then closing opposition says that, celebrities can research and they have the incentive to do so because we're becoming woke. They're competing obligations for these celebrities. They have like tour obligations, but also the research is conducted by their staff as opposed to their own people as well. Therefore, they can get the message maybe like in a page or 2 page, but when they go into like conducting interviews, they may not be able to illustrate themselves in the most effective manner. But secondly, there's a difference between conducting research and then showing empathy towards the people as well. You can show empathy in one performance, but then people are going to internalize this, you using research as a means to an end as well. Then they talked about how this will lead to moderation as well. Craig already gave you many reasons why moderation is something that is not exclusive within to like opposition bench. Like there are many actors that can be seen as moderator as well. Or closing opposition, just like opening opposition, never demonstrated why these performative activists are likely to be the ones that are the most moderate people to begin with as well. And then their point on economic enfranchisement kind of falls out of the debate insofar as the fact that people are still going to perceive this as the fact that social movements are still going to like lose out on some funding if they become unpopular due to association with some characters who are whitewashing and do something bad. Lastly, in comparison to opening government, I think the illustrations that Craig gives don't just apply to like one person who might get affected in like a safe space, but it applies to the entire movement. The movement is the one that is a conglomeration of identities, and insofar as the fact that the movement is the one that brings you more catharsis and gives you more resources, though that is the most significant actor in the debate due to the scale of impact. For all of those reasons, CG.
Great. I think the speaker very much for a fine speech. I'd like to go for the upwhip to end today's debate. Do you still consent to being recorded?
Well, fuck it, why not? Just a debate, no one cares. All right, POIs in the chat, please, and I'll just get my timer up. Debate. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll start by addressing both government teams before weighing our extension against our opening and the round. Let's start with closing government. They make two arguments. The first is that celebrities might generally say bad things, and the single mechanism they give is that they are uninformed, therefore they have no capacity to say good things. 5 responses. First of all, they never prove why it is more likely that celebrities say bad things rather than good things. So just demonstrate that some celebrities are fuckwits, which means when you resolve this issue, you need to weigh up whether or not the sets of good things they do is better than the sets of bad things they do. The easiest way to do this is to explain why it is only in a minority of cases when celebrities will actually say really stupid things. So 4 additional reasons to believe why that is the case. First of all celebrities have PR reps to ensure that they don't tank their public credibility and lose their audience. That means they actually do, contrary to what closing government says, spend hours preparing for interviews and carefully researching what they want to say, or at least have someone do it for them if they're too busy doing things like writing songs. Second of all, obviously they don't generally say extreme things or make things like calls to action, because that opens them up to litigation claims and makes them civilly liable for things like defamation, or means that they can be sued on the grounds that they influenced someone else's decision that then committed a crime, which means that people generally say things that are fairly moderate that shouldn't be taken as a literal call to do current radicalism or really bad things. Thirdly, obviously they tend to say quite mainstream opinions for the reason that this is statistically the most likely opinion to have as an individual, but more importantly because you're going to appeal to the largest audience, and celebrities are selfish and attempting to maximize their reputation, as is conceded by the debate. Fourthly, obviously, as it's explained, people who are going to comment in the first place are probably interested enough that they're going to at least get other people to help educate them so that they can use the research done by someone else and prepare those talking points. So the material about, well, you don't have enough time is irrelevant because someone else does it. That takes out their first argument, and it explains why it's very unlikely that people are running their mouths saying absolutely stupid things. The majority of instances, which is representation and moderation, we explain to be good. So let's move on to their second claim, which is this makes the movement look dumb. Again, 4 responses. The first is that obviously fracturing won't occur if you say something as insane as they claim, like literally raping someone or doing something obscene as like saying all immigrants should be kicked out of the country and killed. And that's for the reason that even if there are disagreements within the movement, everyone in the movement is still similarly aligned in what they believe principally, that they would all turn against this person. Secondly, obviously that then means that the narrative, which is look, I made a tweet that was pro whatever, is insufficient to defend yourself. Thirdly, it means that it is very easy for the movement to disavow you, and they will, since first of all, calling you out makes them look principally consistent and good and gets them clout. And secondly, they are no longer dependent on you, even if they were previously, since you're currently making them look bad. And there are a number of other celebrities, as I've proven, who in the majority of instances are saying good things that you can rely upon. That should explain why what closing government has essentially been able to prove is that sometimes people say claims that are somewhat not fully verified or not fully thought through, which is clearly not the tipping point for any of their arguments about how the movement gets trashed, and is insufficient to weigh out against any of the other claims that we explain they are more likely to do this positively. No closing government, put your hand down. So, opening government, what is their argument? Their argument, firstly, is that it would be good if if celebrities just supported radical issues, because then we could change the system. Apologies, I didn't mean to say rude to closing government then. I'm running on like no hours sleep. I just meant I'll take you later. Sorry about that. The first thing is that obviously this is actually quite bad for safe spaces, not only for the reason it means that less people join the movement in the first instance, and therefore you actually have less people supporting you and are able to offer that support, but secondly, for the active harm, which is people take up active opposition to that movement when it is seen as radical. People actively go out and do things like find queer people to persecute, show up to anti-queer rallies, for example, and create an environment that instead of being neutral but not supportive is actively harmful to those individuals, which wins on that first metric for opening government. Secondly, it just allows all movements to be painted as radical by things like the media and opposition, which dramatically removes all of their capital, even movements that weren't particularly radical, which means that unless you believe every single movement is radical, which I'm about to explain and Ellie explains is bad, it's a harm. But thirdly, as is explained, many of them won't call for it, which just means you normalize the status quo and don't really affect the debate at all. The next claim by opening government is that, well, now your voice will dominate the movement. Opening opposition says you want to seem like a better ally, therefore you don't dominate. Here's 2 better responses. First of all, as opening government claim, social movements need to have capital in the first place to get anything done, which should explain why social movements would be willing to trade off not having their entire voice all of the time for huge amounts of additional capital, so they can actually get people to show up to protest in the first place, which explains why from the perspective of the actor and the success of the movement, this is not a harm. Second of all, celebrities obviously, as Ellie points out, don't want to be criticized by the movement because they are seen incompetent, which means they won't do this in the worst possible way and in ways that allow the movement to eventually say their voice and propagate their opinion in the future. The final claim, and the worst, made by opening government is that now people will like not look at what the Black Panthers did and do a Taylor Swift presentation because they'll get a bad Google result or something. Couple of responses. The first is that the comparative that they brought seems to be that people take vigilante action representing a decentralized movement and are not consulted on what they do, which means in many instances, according to opening government's analysis, they do things like blow up pipelines, which first of all exposes a huge number of innocent people to death, causes economic disruption if you blow up a pipeline of an oil company in an area where there is no other oil provider, which means that people don't have electricity, they starve in their homes in winter if they live in Europe and they can't get gas to heat their fucking house. But thirdly, it means that as is conceded, many governments will just crack down on not just this social movement, which is bad for that movement, but every other movement as it is seen a threat to stability, which now much more people are likely to support. Before I go on, I don't know, OG.
This is not about theories of change, moderate versus radical, but about the chronology of performative activism. Taylor Swift galvanizes no one. She is being galvanized, but by what is currently at the center of the Overton window.
I honestly have no idea what those words mean. Like, it just sounds like you've picked words out of a dictionary, like the chronology of performative action. You at DPM counterprop what I just rebutted. You can't go back on it in a POI. All right, let's weigh our extension against opening opposition and then the round. Opening opposition speculate over the marginal changes to the movement and the amount of additional support they might get. There are a number of questions you should ask before you're willing to credit this argument. First of all, how much more do people actually care? Second of all, does this persist into the long term, or is it only a week's amount of care that people have when the issue is relevant? Second of all, do they actually push for good policies as the movement? Thirdly, does this preference they have for liking the movement override any other concerns they have, like time that they might not be able to give to the movement? So many questions about the efficacy, particularly because they set up the problem to be so large, means this is speculative and unlikely. Compare that to our debate, our benefits that should win the round. First of all, we explain far more concretely that this is likely to just fulfill people's preferences and make an incredibly large number of people immediately happy and feel better about themselves, which is certain, so you should weigh it highly, and affects an incredibly large number of people. Second of all, we explain that moderation is a good force because it promotes productive discourse about things that can actually be changed, as opposed to empowering people to self-implode the movement. Vote CO.
Great. I thank the speaker very much for a fine speech and for a wonderful debate. Please virtually cause the floor, shake hands. This is a closed round. You'll you can come for the result and the feedback after the break, or you could watch it on YouTube, whatever you prefer. Okay. Welcome back to the OA of this closed round. Always interesting to give these things. I'll give the call and then I'll justify it. Ultimately, I saw this as a short cross, with the first going to closing government, second going to opening opposition, third going to closing opposition, and fourth going to opening government. So first to CG, second to OO, third to CO, fourth to OG. Why did I arrive at this call? From opening government, we get the general case, which goes along the lines of, currently these voices are not the most adequate and most perfect interpretation of what the issues or the problems and concerns raised could be. This is because these people that are doing this type of performative art themselves don't have the lived experiences, they don't necessarily care, they may have alternative motives, etc., etc. Meaning, and after that, they necessarily co-opt or at least associate the social movement with you, which leads to, I quote, less radical policies being enacted, and quote, we need more radical policies being enacted. So the first and most basic problem that I have with this case is I don't understand why radical policies are good. It is not justified. The way this is explained is that radical policies require radical means. I don't necessarily understand what that's the case. I just need a comprehensive explanation to buy this claim. I don't think the average informed voter necessarily would be persuaded by such an explanation. But secondly is, even if I were to buy that this case is adequate in terms of impacting, the premise within the case is that this is somehow mutually exclusive between these two things. The justification that you try to provide from opening government as to why they're mutually exclusive is there already exists an adequate buildup of progressive values and progressive people that would exist within this sphere to begin with. Number one, this still doesn't prove why these things are mutually exclusive, and opposition points out to that these things are actually mutually supportive within each other. But even absent of any opposition reply or things like that, I honestly don't understand why Taylor Swift talking about something doesn't allow other actors also to talk about something. This logic is not explained. But secondly, you never justify the burden, and this was POI to you multiple times, as to why would these actors alternatively act this way. You point out to other actors alternatively having greater capacity to act, but not necessarily why the actors themselves currently acting, i.e. Taylor Swift acting in this way, would do it. Given that's the case, and given the case has so many problems, it's really, really hard to see if there is substantial arguments coming from opening government, even to begin with. But how does the opening opposition deal with this? One, opening opposition is simply able to respond by saying that these people aren't necessarily that problematic. They do have like knowledge, they have an incentive to inform themselves, they have people to do that, and they're giving it sufficient amount of time to do so. And secondly, that these people in many of these cases are actually gateway drugs in order to get people from broke to woke, if that's a saying at all. I'm not woke, so I wouldn't know, but like from broke to woke, from them to understand these type of things. They give many reasons and illustrations as to why this is the case, and they also have an independent argument which wasn't really addressed by opening government, which goes along the lines of, hey, at least these people because of this narrative, or at least give some kind of cash, whether it's people or it's companies now, because they want to basically signal to people that their work, they're actually going to donate specifically to causes, which seems like an independent impact within of itself. So given that's the case, it's pretty obvious that opening opposition beats opening government. Let's bring in closing government to the mix. Closing government give the following extension. Many of these people structurally that would want to do this type of behavior are actually bad people. This is either based upon the nature of their existence, i.e. corporations, for example, needing to pollute in order to raise their bottom line, or abusers needing to donate to women's causes in order to not be caught as who they are, or secondly, simply put based on their existence, paparazzis being around you, you doing something like getting drunk, and things like that. All of these things mean that it creates that the association between the social movement and these types of personas creates a particular risk of a scandal or some kind of problem happening between them, which either leads to two situations. Either the person or entity are able to whitewash their behavior, thus you're actually committing on net more harms based upon this particular activity, i.e., if you're able to donate to like, let's say, a feminist movement, but you're actually abusing women, you're creating more harm. Or if a company donates to, for example, an environmental movement, but is actually polluting everywhere, this causes a lot more damage. Or if it's the case where they can't whitewash their image, the association between these two distance people from supporting the social movements, distance their credibility within society, and ultimately distance the probability of change that they're likely to do. These are broadly the case that closing government runs within the debate. Why does this beat opening opposition? The first and most basic reason that this beats opening opposition is that it actually explains that the support that you're likely to receive is on net likely to be less so comparatively when this type of things happens. So if closing government is able to prove people now feel themselves less associated with the social movement, less willing to donate, less willing to go and protest, then this undercuts the mechanism. But even if these two things were to be equal, let's say I'm not able to, I just think closing government's analysis is much better explained and much more adequate than opening oppositions, because closing government's analysis is much more linearly explained than opening opposition that's some premise here, some analysis there, and things like that. But even if both analyses are completely the same, if we have to adjudicate it based on the second clash, which is opening opposition says at least they donate money, closing government says they donate money but they abuse now comparatively more, the harms that closing government outlines in terms of these actors actually, for example, polluting more, for example, abusing more and things like that, seem to be a lot bigger than the question mark that I have on the benefits of donations coming from opening opposition. Because opening opposition stands up and says, okay, we have like donations and things like that, but you never really explain how this money actually helps people. I know like it's intuitively good, but in order for us to weigh these contributions, I would need a visualization of this type of argument, which I think more conclusively comes in closing government. Comparing closing government to opening government, the case is much more asymmetric in terms of I understand that these actors are on the comparative unlikely to do this, given that they can't whitewash their image by doing this. And I think it's much more substantially well explained, much more logical than that of opening government. So that's why closing government beats both top half teams. Bringing closing opposition to the mix. And closing opposition is the hardest team to position in this debate, mainly because closing opposition doesn't do any differentiation or weighing between themselves and opening opposition. The problem with closing opposition is that many of the things that closing opposition talks about either already exist in opening opposition or are additional bits and pieces of analysis towards the case that's coming from there. I.e., when, for example, closing opposition stands up and says, all these people have PR teams, they're likely to be knowledgeable because they'll be dogpiled, I hope I'm saying this properly, within the comment section and things like that. This already exists in opening opposition. They have the same line of response. When they see things, for example, that this allows a lower entry of not advisorship, but like, being woke, like sharing to people and how woke you are and things like that, and like doing these like low-hanging fruit types of engagement between people. This is literally opening opposition's argument as well, where they say people feel good when they see this welcoming type of wokeness that they are being associated with. So like it's very hard to compare these things. The only thing that truly is unique that comes from closing opposition is one, a explanation as to why moderation is good, which I think very well responds to opening government, given that opening government explicitly states that we don't want moderation, and that's why your closing opposition is able to beat opening government, but doesn't necessarily respond to opening opposition, because opening opposition, even though they say they care about radicalism, the analysis that opening opposition provides isn't about radicalism. So this is value neutral to the other two teams that are contested within the debate. The argument about you being able to like talk about like very short fixes like AI revenge porn and things like that is under mechanized. I don't necessarily understand how Taylor Swift talking about this necessarily deals with this particular issue, other than the same analysis that goes along the lines of she has massive power to persuade people and things like that. And even if I buy it as yours, it's not necessarily weighed against the other contributions coming from opening opposition in terms of them explaining that this makes people feel good when they interact between each other, or that this leads to greater systematic change as a gateway drug. What else is left from closing opposition? The argument about, for example, like this being a business venture, things like that. It's valuable, it's nice, but it's not impacted. The impact goes along the lines of, if there is an organic search or something, then that must be good. Then people care about this. Sure. Why should I care more about this than any other consideration within the debate? And finally, the only thing that truly remains from opening opposition are two things. The first is that there is a response to the evil men argument, which is to say people hate hypocrisy. But the analysis coming from closing government in this moment is, actually, these things either happen because you have malintent, or it happens due to mistake, which doesn't necessarily mean that the hypocrisy analysis lands, right? Because you as the social movement don't necessarily know that these people are bad actors when you start engaging with them, or at least that's the underlying premise coming from closing government. And the responses that are in the GovWhip towards closing government are along the lines of things that people say, which is response to opening government, but not things that people do, which is the case for me from closing government, which is that people do bad things and now they're more motivated to do bad things. Given all of this, and given there is, again, no differentiation attempt from all closing opposition, it's very, very hard to place them above opening opposition, who like have a clear case, and the cases are too very close to each other. So the additional marginal small things that closing opposition adds don't necessarily further the persuasiveness of the case coming from opening opposition, but also the responses don't necessarily land very well against the case coming from closing government. And also there isn't an attempt to weigh against closing government. The way closing opposition tries to be closing government is via responses, but those responses are not based on the case the closing government wants. So I spent so much time talking about closing opposition because they're the hardest team to position in the round solely on this. But so this is the call. I hope it makes sense. And yeah, like and subscribe.